And so the first thing we want to know is, how long have you guys been doing high tunnel raspberries?
We have been doing high tunnel raspberries. Our first raspberries, which are these, were planted in 2010.
It's a long time. So 10 years these have been in the same tunnels.
10 years these have been in the same tunnels.
Okay, and what varieties are you growing?
Right now we have Polka, Joan Jay, we've got some Himotop, we've got some Anam Brit that we're working on right now, this is being the fall of the year. We are also doing summer bearing, which are Nova, which is our primary summer bearing raspberry, and Encore.
Okay, so is it mostly fall bearing?
We do 50-50.
Okay.
50% summer, 50% fall bearing. And some of our summer bearing will come back and reproduce in the fall as well.
All right. And so how many tunnels do you have of fall bearing and summer bearing raspberries?
We have a total of 3 tunnels summer bearing, 3 tunnels fall bearing. Each tunnel is a 1/4 acre for a total of 1.5 acres.
All right, great. And so as anybody probably knows who's listening, most farmers in Minnesota haven't switched over to high tunnel raspberries yet. A lot of folks are still doing open field raspberries, but you guys were kind of innovators for the high tunnel raspberries. You started doing it a while ago. So what made you decide to do high tunnel production?
Well, basically we decided to do high tunnel production because we were tired of going out every morning to pick raspberries for our retail stands after a rain. Every time you go out after rain, those berries would be bruised on the ground, everything would all fallen apart. Where we can go out here after a heavy storm and everything is covered, protected, we kind of ensure ourselves of having a crop.
And do you notice a quality difference in the berries between the open field and the high tunnel?
In standard days in the open field, 4 out of 7 days of the week, they're almost identical. It's those 3 days of the week when you have a lot of wind, when you have heavy rain, when you have hail events, that you end up with softer berries.
Okay. And do you notice that the berry size is bigger at all, or is that about the same?
Our berry size was larger to start, but right now our berry size is kind of leveled off. It's very similar to what we could produce outside.
Okay. So now that we've done a little bit of an overview of why somebody might do high tunnel raspberries, let's kind of dissect the system and talk about how this is set up, what the different parts are, and how somebody might go about setting up a high tunnel raspberry system.
Well, the first thing to start with would be your tunnel. These here are Haygrove high tunnels. These are a 3-season tunnel. The top comes off every winter, goes on every spring. We really have to be careful. They aren't structurally sound for snow load, especially here in Minnesota. It's a major part of what we do. We have to really manage for the snow, making sure we don't put things on too early. We like to have a nice wide tunnel, high tunnel, so we can get some air movement through here. Try to make sure we space our rows far enough apart. Not only do you have to get in there and harvest, you have to be able to get in there and spray. You have to be able to get the air movement coming through to make sure everything goes where it needs to go.
Mm-hmm. And how many feet do you have between rows?
Our rows are 6 feet apart. It's a 24-foot wide tunnel. We have 6-foot aisles on the outside and in the middles.
Okay. And what might you say to somebody who's really tempted to squeeze their rows together to say 3 or 4 feet?
Put yourself in the picker's shoes and in the sprayer's shoes and in your worker's shoes. And then put yourself in the plant's shoes. You want to have that air. You want things to be able to breathe and move around you. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to control some of those pathogens and diseases.
Right. And so with the tunnel where you've got your rows spaced 6 feet apart, what's the average production for one tunnel in a year?
Average production for a tunnel for 1 year, we can pull about 250 flats per season out of a tunnel.
Okay, and how long are your tunnels?
Our tunnels are a 1/4 of an acre.
Okay.
They're 500 feet long, 24 feet wide.
And then how much is a flat? I think you were about to say it.
A flat is 12 pints.
Okay, good, good. So that's pretty good production, right?
That seems to be very good production for us.
Awesome. Okay, so we talked about row spacing, and then I see you've got landscape fabric between the rows.
Yes, we have landscape fabric between all our rows. That is to help with weed protection and to allow us to clean up the tunnels after we've harvested. We usually try to go through and clean everything up and sweep them down every time we harvest berries.
Have you ever had to replace the landscape fabric?
We've replaced it once.
All right. Okay, so next, let's talk about your trellis system. This is something that I've talked about with a few different growers who are interested in putting in a high tunnel of raspberries, and I know that everybody does it a little bit differently. So can you explain your end post systems and the wires
our
between?
end posts are actually just a standard 3 to 4 inch post supported by an angle post brought up to a V that's standing upright. When we first put them in, we actually went with an inverted V and put them in upside down, thinking we would have the lower branches bearing lower and then the next branches bearing a little higher. But we could never reach those top berries because the lower branches were sticking out. So now we've gone to a V that's standing upright, and we will go and just constantly be putting the branches inside the wires all summer long.
All right. How much work would you say that is to put the branches inside the wires?
Putting the branches inside the wires and tying everything up, it seems like a never-ending job.
Yeah.
We're out here at least 1 day a week guiding everything inside the wires. If you wait too long, it becomes a 2 day a week job. Just like everything else, if you don't do it on time, you double your work.
Right, right. So I was just at a farm this morning before I came here who was asking, she just planted high tunnel raspberries this year. And so right now they're pretty small. They've been establishing very slowly. First, was that your experience when you first planted these, that the plants took a kind of a long time that first year to really get going?
For us, our first couple seasons, the first year, our plants took off. We really made sure our fertility and everything was right there where it needed to be. We took our soil tests, we did our sap tests, measuring our tissue, just making sure all our nutrients were where they were supposed to be. But as the tunnels have been getting more mature, it seems like our plants have been slowing down a little bit. And some of the questions we're asking ourselves is, how many years can you grow raspberries in the same tunnel? Mm-hmm. A lot of people have told me no more than 8 years. Well, we're working on 10 years production in these raspberries.
If somebody's looking for advice on how do you get your high tunnel raspberries to grow really tall, really straight, and really productive, could you give us some pieces of advice on how you guys have been successful with that?
I guess the biggest thing for us is managing our nutrients. We do a lot of tissue sampling, sap testing, knowing where our nutrients are at, making sure we have the water. The couple of years we've really struggled, we've been short on water, whether the drip tape has plugged, whether we just haven't been putting enough water down for what they need. It's amazing how much water they need inside the tunnels. And then the other part is making sure we keep our spacing and everything. We really try to thin them every year. We try to keep them, 8 inches apart between canes.
Okay. And the irrigation question, I know that's something that we get questions on a lot too, in extension, and more this year than in past years for me, actually. I've been having more and more people ask about how do you measure soil moisture and how do you make sure that your irrigation system is working as it's supposed to. So do you have a way for consistently measuring soil moisture?
The best way we do it is by walking and watching.
Okay.
We don't have anything that measures it. We do go in and we feel the ground every day before we irrigate, after we irrigate, and we walk every line up and down. You can tell really quick whether or not you've got a plug in your drip system or there's an area that's not receiving water. Those plants will tell you real quick.
Okay. And do you use any fertigation?
We do use fertigation. We're constantly measuring what our sap analysis is, or our tissue analysis, to see what we're in excess of, what we're lacking for nutrients, and then we correct via the drip or foliar.
Okay. And you say drip or foliar, but do you ever just broadcast like granular fertilizer on the ground?
We no longer do that.
And why is that?
Well, we have a hard time getting it incorporated into the ground now that these are established berries. We don't have the rain to come help wash it in, and all our drip is in one small area. It's not going to work in all those nutrients that are spread into a foot and a half wide area.
So let's talk about spotted wing Drosophila, or SWD, everybody's favorite topic. This year has not been normal for SWD for whatever reason, but in a typical year, what's the spotted wing Drosophila pressure like in your tunnels?
In a typical season, SWD, or spotted wing Drosophila, is our highest pressure pest compared to the rest of the pests that we deal with in a high tunnel setting. SWD can wipe out our tunnels in a matter of days. with the pressure we've had in the past. We've had years where we've had 90% infestation inside the tunnels. But it all comes down to just a management practice. We have to know where we're picking, when we're picking, where we're picking next, and just make sure we keep our rotation and keep our insecticides going down.
Okay, so can you talk more about that? Because it sounds like your farm is trying to do a lot to make sure that you're not having to spray more than you need to, and you're really utilizing cultural practices for pest control. So can you talk about what some of those cultural practices are for SWD?
Some of those cultural practices, cleanliness. We try to make sure everything is kept clean. We're trying to keep the ripe berries picked off. We're trying not to allow any overripe berries to fall down. And if they do fall down, let's get them picked up and moved off site. Try to keep the weeds out the best we can. Air movement. Anytime you have a dark space inside your canopy, that's a good spot for your SWD to hide. So that's where pruning and everything comes in as another practice to keep SWD away.
And do you try to harvest every tunnel every day?
We do not.
Okay.
We do not harvest every tunnel every day because we do need to spray. And most sprays for raspberries have at least a 1-day PHI. You know, you can use Pyganic, which is a 0, but most of the others have a 1-day PHI. So we're trying to measure where are we harvesting that day. We'll spray that tunnel. We'll try to pick out that tunnel and then save the next tunnels for the following day or the day after.
Okay. And so you do utilize, it sounds like, organic insecticides for SWD, because you mentioned Pyganic.
Yep.
So as far as the organic options go, which ones have you tried and which do you find most effective?
As far as organic, Pyganic is probably for us the most broad spectrum for SWD. We've used Entrust with some mixed results on that, but with either one of those two, it's just keeping on top of it. Don't let SWD get ahead of you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then as far as synthetic or conventional pesticides, how often do you have to spray those for SWD?
Well, we use those. Those are our backup plan around here.
Right.
There's another tool in our toolbox. We'll use them when need be. We don't want to spray Pyganic every day. So we may come in with a Mustang, with a Radiant, with something else for a rotation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, what other questions did I have? We were talking about nutrients a while ago.
Yep.
And fertigation, sap testing. So foliar testing comes in really handy for figuring out how much you actually need to fertilize.
Correct.
We talked about this a little bit earlier. Can you go through and talk about how somebody would take a foliar test from a raspberry plant?
Taking a foliar test, sap test is a little bit different than a tissue sample. Mm-hmm. But sap testing, you'll come in, you're looking for older leaves, which would be your leaves a little farther down in the plant. You want an old sample of an old leaf. You will want a young sample of a truly developed young leaf. What it is your old leaf is your bank account. That's your new nutrient storage on a lot of these nutrients. Your young leaf is what is available to the actively growing part of the plant. Now, if it's not available if it's not in the young leaf, what's the reason for it? Is there a nutrient tying it up that's not allowing it? Do you have excess potassium? Do you have excess nutrients that aren't allowing that to travel up the plant? Or do you just have a lack of nutrients? And those are things you have to look at when you're looking at these tests.
So for sap testing, you're actually submitting both young leaves and new leaves?
Correct.
Or young leaves and old leaves?
Correct.
Okay. Whereas for a regular foliar tissue test like that you would send to University of Minnesota, you're just taking
trying to grab an average leaf.
Yep, an average fully formed mature leaf.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. But for sap testing, is it true that you have to submit those samples to the Netherlands, or
Well,
what do you do with that?
our tissues actually get sent to a company in Indiana who sends them off to Europe to get processed.
Okay.
But we still get our results in typically 3 to 5 business days.
Wow.
And the difference between sap testing and tissue testing is that sap testing tells you where things are moving, where things are going. Tissue testing only tells you where you're at now.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that pretty much wraps up our portion of this field day on high tunnel raspberries. Of course, if people have more questions, they can ask them during the Q&A portion of this. But I guess the last question would be, if a newer farmer or somebody who's never done this is thinking about it, what is your one piece of advice you would give them?
The one piece of advice I have is network. work with other farmers that are dealing with the same problems you're dealing with. Sometimes they'll have an idea that'll solve the problem that we've never thought of before. It doesn't have to be a farmer in Minnesota. It could be a farmer from the East Coast. It could be a farmer from Europe. But always try new ideas and feel free to ask different questions.
All right, that's great advice. Well, thanks, Paul.
Oh, just wondering if you've seen an increase in lateral growth over the past few years, as this year had some that were just tremendous, so that, the continuous pruning has been more challenging, and had some of them that were just, amazing growth on those things. So.
Yeah, this year there was a lot of growth on all the berries, whether they be the summer bearing or the fall bearing, and we tended to just have to do a lot more pruning as the season went along, as you said.
Weed control practices in high tunnels versus outside growing conditions.
Our weed control in the high tunnels is strictly all hand weeding. We don't use any chemical herbicides or anything in our high tunnels. There are quite a few pre-emergents that we've looked at, but as long as we keep our water where we want it to be, we tend to be able to our best weed control is by hand.
Okay, we have a couple questions on pruning techniques and procedures. How do you prune your raspberries?
Well, our summer bearing raspberries, we just trim them back in the fall. We'll put them all inside our trellises, make sure everything's in there. We'll just cut off the top of our summer bearing at the top of our trellis. And then in the spring, we'll go through and we'll thin out our dead canes and thin them to about 8 inches apart. Just selecting the canes that we feel will be our strongest canes. And then in our fall bearing's much easier. We go through in the spring, we mow them all off, we haul the old canes out. And then as the summer goes on, as we get to our first or second trellis wire, we'll go in and we'll select our canes about 8 inches apart. Or most of our guys, if you take your thumb to your pinky and you spread it out, that's kind of what we're trying to do. And we're trying to keep our rows themselves about 8 to 10 inches wide.
Okay. Another question, are you sampling leaves from primal canes or floricanes?
We will sample from both.
Okay. Another question, how do I use high tunnel in my garden or a smaller raspberry operation? Either Annie or Paul.
Well, I can take a crack at it first. So if you have a garden or a really small operation, you might not just go right in and build a high tunnel. A caterpillar tunnel might be a better fit for you to start out with. So if you just Google caterpillar tunnel, you'll get a visual of what I'm talking about. So it's a shorter tunnel, but it gives you the idea of growing in protected culture and what that might be like.
Okay.
And sometimes in your backyard, if you just put some smaller hoops up and over them, that'll also allow you to do some netting and some other things to avoid some SWD pressure.
Do you deal with Japanese beetles in the high tunnels? And if so, how do you effectively handle them?
Japanese beetles for us at Untiedt tend not to be much of a problem on our raspberries. They tend to be more of a problem with their larvae in our deneutral strawberry production.
Somebody wanted to clarify what primocanes and floricanes.
Sure. So the primocanes are the current year's growth. The floricanes are the canes that started growing in the previous year.
Here's another one. Labor requirements per tunnel in hours in terms of managing plastic.
In terms of managing plastic, as far as putting plastic up and taking plastic down in our tunnels, it's a daily occurrence. We will move that plastic up, move it down depending upon the weather. We tend to try to leave it up a little more in the fall, but then all our plastic must be applied in the spring. and we're trying to cover a 24-foot by 500-foot tunnel, that tends to take us, we tend to be able to get about 8 to 15 tunnels in a day completed. It all depends upon the wind. But other than that, the daily management of plastic is not a major issue unless, you know, what we just went through the last few weeks where we had some below zero temperatures or freezing temperatures at night. And we were trying to open during the day to ventilate and keep the disease pressure down, and then close towards the evening just so we could keep what heat we had in the tunnels.